Have you ever pondered why the majority of slaves were from Africa and not from Asia or Europe? To understand this, we must get into the history, tracing the roots of slavery, its geographical distribution, and genetic predisposition. The history of slavery is as old as civilization itself. Some of the earliest records of slavery date back to the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia around 1754 BC. This code refers to slavery as an established institution. However, the concept of slavery was different then. It was not based on race, but rather on debt, punishment for crime, or the outcome of war. Fast forward to the 7th century AD, the trans-Saharan slave trade began. This was the first time Africa became a hub for the slave trade. The Islamic Empire, which stretched across North Africa, was in high demand for slaves, both for labor and military service. The trade routes across the difficult Sahara Desert connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Islamic Empire, paving the way for a robust slave trade system. The 15th century marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans, primarily the Portuguese, started to explore African coasts. It was the closeness of Africa to Europe and the Americas that made the continent an easy target for slave traders. This proximity, coupled with an already established local system of slavery, made Africa the ideal source for slaves. The 16th to 19th centuries witnessed the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas and the Caribbean. But why Africans? Why not Asians or Europeans? By this time, malaria had become a deadly force in the tropical and subtropical regions of the world. Africans, having lived in such conditions for generations, had developed certain genetic traits that offered resistance to this disease. This made them more suitable for work in the plantations of the Americas and the Caribbean, where malaria was rampant. In contrast, Europeans and Asians didn't have this resistance, making them less ideal for work in these conditions. Moreover, Europe, recovering from the effects of the plague and the 100 Years' War, was experiencing a labor shortage. As for Asia, it was geographically distant and politically fragmented, making it less accessible for slave traders. The abolitionist movement in the late 18th century marked the beginning of the end for the transatlantic slave trade. The British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act in 1807, making it illegal to engage in the slave trade throughout the British Empire. The United States followed suit in 1808. However, slavery itself was not abolished in these regions until decades later. In conclusion, the reasons why most slaves were from Africa are multifaceted. It was a combination of geographical proximity, an existing local system of slavery, and the biological advantage of malaria resistance that made Africans the primary victims of this inhumane trade. While slavery has been legally abolished, its legacy continues to impact societies worldwide, making it a historical phenomenon that deserves our understanding and remembrance.